My name is Arthur. I'm a PhD student at UChicago, studying computer science, and I'm going to talk a little bit about data subject access rights today. So it's been a few years now that companies have been adapting and adjusting to the GDPR and CCPA, CPRA, just to name a few. And in particular, companies have had to implement the ability for users to exercise their right of access, which usually manifests through making a data subject access request, or DSAR. The way a DSAR usually works is a user will send a DSAR to your company. Some automated process will collect and convert all of the personal data into a collection of files, which then are compressed and sent back to the user in the form of a data export, is what we're calling it, which is made up of usually one, but sometimes more than one of these zip files. And of course, how one makes a DSAR varies quite a bit from company to company. So this could be as simple as just sending an email to, like privacy@insertnameofyourcompany.com. It could be a little bit more in depth. It could mean going to your settings page and clicking on a button that will export all your data, maybe in just a single file. Or it could be a highly configurable process where you get to pick exactly what gets exported and sometimes even how it gets exported, in the case of like Google Takeout, for example. Unsurprisingly, the data export you get back really depends on the company you made this DSAR for. So let's just say if you're a gig worker on a dog sitting platform, your export will look like a single PDF with this. If you made a DSAR with Google, your export will include at least an interactive HTML file that'll give you some explanation of what you're looking at, and on top of that, a bunch of files and folders. And where I'm coming from, my lab, we really tend to focus on improving user experience. So we're kind of putting compliance, all that aside, and we're really looking at how we can evaluate and improve these data exports. And so we investigated. In the first of the two studies I'm going to talk about today, which was published at SOUPS in 2021, the team ran some codesign sessions, ideation sessions, and a survey with the participants of this study. And there were two big takeaways here. The first is that users are often unable really to explore the files in their data export because of the format of these files often. So most people don't really know how to open a JSON or even an HTML file. The second is that participants were overwhelmed by the amount of data and the amount of files and folders in a lot of these exports, which essentially was a non-starter for them to explore their data because they didn't even know where to start. We kind of took these 2 points and decided to investigate them a little bit further and kind of address them at the same time. In our second study, which I'll be talking more about later this fall at USENIX Security, in this study, we actually built an interactive data exploration and annotation tool so that users could get over this hurdle of the inability to open a CSV, JSON, etc. And for the rest of the talk, I'm going to talk about the research questions that we had as part of this study and some of the findings from the study as well. One of the big questions we had was, what do users want from data exports? So we know what GDPR and CCPA say, but is this kind of what users want at the end of the day? And to kind of get at this, before we had users explore their data, our participants, we asked them to come up with some questions that they would want answered by the time they were done exploring their data. And we found 4 main categories of questions here. The first is users wanted to know what was being stored. So this included things like, do you store my IP address? Do you store my payment information? And these questions were answered about half the time, so for half of our participants who had this particular question. And usually they were successful when they were these more generic data record types that we'd expect most companies to have, like times for login, for example. Next up, users were curious about how their data was being stored. So this included things like the format. So as we said before, is this in a CSV table? Is this in a JSON? And it also included things like the length of storage. And experts were actually pretty good at answering these questions. They were almost always successfully answered. Third, people were curious about how their data was being used. So this included things like, are you selling my data to another company? Are you using this data to show me ads? And much like the first question, this was kind of answered about half the time. And lastly, users were also really curious to learn about high-level takeaways from their data. And this one, we found data experts are not really good at doing at all. So why? Like, what are the barriers here? What are the challenges that are making these data exports kind of hard to use for most users? And to kind of talk about that, I'm going to show you the experience that users had in using our web app. If you were one of our participants, you'd get to the screen, you'd upload your data export, you'd be able to search for terms in this export, search for different files as well, and then jump through different parts of the file. We then asked you to highlight the parts that stood out to you, and then we also asked you to justify and kind of explain why these things stood out to you in the first place. And these annotations, as we called them, are what we use to kind of make the conclusions that I'm about to share with you. So once again, users were pretty overwhelmed. For many, this overwhelm came just from the sheer number of files and folders in a lot of these exports. And even when a user was able to find the file or data they were looking for, sometimes they really weren't sure how to interpret the content of the file. So, whenever they would open a JSON file, they'd see something like encrypted backup controls and this bunch of digits, and they really wouldn't know how to answer this question, because even for the exports that had more interactive and explanatory elements, not everything was addressed. And this lack of clarity sometimes went beyond just lack of a barrier to comprehension. It actually was a source of distrust for some users. Again, in this file, it's not immediately clear why Google, in this case, would need to keep track of the different times that my Google location history timeline was created, just as an example. And upon discovering these hidden records, many participants just kind of responded with well, I want this gone. I want this deleted, which might seem like kind of intense and whoa, but there are kind of two silver linings with this. The first one is that it was really rare for a participant to want their whole account deleted, or everything from a product deleted just because they found a specific piece of data that they didn't like. Usually they wanted this surgical precision in deleting things that they just that they didn't like. And second is, when offered a justification for this data retention, a lot of users became okay with this. So if you were to explain oh, we just keep track of this to make sure we're keeping track of consistent location, I'm just making this up, a lot of users were actually okay with this data retention. And as a result, we kind of identified this tension that exists in data exports right now, which is this tension between machine readability and portability, and then human intelligibility and accessibility. And we think that in order to make these exports useful, we have to prioritize this human element as much as we prioritize the machine element right now. So kind of wrapping things up, I have 4 kind of key feature recommendations that I think, or that we think future data access tools should have. Focus on data exports. The first tackles data definitions. So this is about almost 400,000 lines into my Spotify streaming history file. And while it would be great to have a definition for each of these JSON keys, what if we included the definitions alongside the data that was being explored so that users don't have to go look for another file and find this other definition? Or even better, and this is just a crude mock-up, what if we just got rid of this necessity to translate something by just communicating it to the user in the way they'd understand? Second, we found that searching and filtering was pretty crucial for users to interact with their files, because without the searching or filtering function, they would just get lost in the wave of files and folders. And on top of this, it was pretty important for users too to be able to toggle between this verbose kind of representation of their data and this more summarized high level as well, because as I mentioned before, when they saw things they didn't like, or when they saw things that they thought should be there, when they noticed missing data, they became distrustful. Finally, users were interested in exercising their other data privacy rights, such as the right to deletion, alongside the exploration of the data as well. And this is back to the idea of the surgical deletion of the data that they weren't comfortable with companies having. Yeah, and this was the same for modification as well. And to wrap things up, a question that maybe you're having and kind of I had in the beginning of this project as well is, is it even useful to improve like data subject access tools or like data exports? Like, would people use it? Well, we kind of think they would. So if you're not a user of Spotify, every year they kind of do this Spotify Wrapped thing that just shows you your use of the app basically throughout the year. And this is not the only example of like making your personal data from a company interesting and interactive for others. There are lots of examples from just random people on the internet where this is becoming more often. And we really think that this can be leveraged, this like data exploration experience, to promote a user's engagement with parts of the personal data in platforms that they might find less interesting, like their privacy settings. And this is kind of what I hope to leave you with, and like the fourth kind of last key feature here, which is what would like a privacy-focused or transparency-focused like wrapped experience look like through like these data exports. And with that, that's the end of my talk.